The Kincaid family arrived in Savannah, Georgia, on a sweltering summer afternoon, their car laboring up the long, winding driveway to the heart of Magnolia Manor. The plantation house loomed ahead, a grand but decaying structure surrounded by towering oak trees draped in Spanish moss. Janet Kincaid, her husband Tom, and their teenage children, Emily and Jake, stepped out of the car, their expressions a mix of awe and apprehension. Janet glanced at the letter in her hand, the elegant script detailing the inheritance from a distant relative she barely remembered. As a historian, she couldn't help but feel a thrill at the prospect of uncovering the manor's secrets. But the air seemed heavy with more than just humidity. The caretaker, Mr. Harper, met them at the front steps. He was an elderly man with a weathered face and a slow, deliberate way of speaking. His eyes, however, were sharp and filled with a silent warning as he handed over the heavy iron keys. "Welcome to Magnolia Manor," he said, his voice gravelly. "This house has a long history, Mrs. Kincaid, some of it not pleasant. If you need anything, I live just down the road." Janet thanked him, though his words left her uneasy. As they entered the house, the creaking door seemed to echo through the vast, shadowed interior. Dust motes danced in the slivers of sunlight filtering through the tall, grimy windows. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and forgotten memories. The foyer opened into a grand staircase, its banister intricately carved but worn from years of use. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors lined the walls, their eyes seeming to follow the newcomers. Emily shivered, feeling the weight of their gazes. "This place is huge," Jake said, his voice reverberating through the empty halls. "Kind of creepy, though." Tom chuckled, trying to lighten the mood. "It's just an old house, Jake. We'll fix it up in no time." They spent the afternoon exploring the manor. Each room seemed to whisper of the past, from the parlor with its faded velvet furniture to the dining room where a massive table stood like an altar. The kitchen, with its old-fashioned stove and pantry stocked with ancient jars, spoke of simpler yet harder times. As night fell, they gathered in the parlor. Janet had found an old journal in a dusty drawer, its leather cover cracked and its pages yellowed with age. Intrigued, she began to read aloud, her voice the only sound in the otherwise silent house. "June 12th, 1857, she began. "Today was another sweltering day at Magnolia Manor. The heat is relentless and the work never ends. Samuel and the others are restless. I fear there may be trouble brewing." The family listened, captivated by the window into the past. But as Janet read on, the journal's tone grew darker, detailing the brutal treatment of slaves and the mounting tension on the plantation. A sudden chill swept through the room, and the flickering candlelight cast eerie shadows on the walls. Janet looked up, feeling an inexplicable sense of dread. The journal fell silent in her hands as a distant cry echoed through the house, faint but unmistakable. "Did you hear that?" Emily whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Tom nodded, his earlier bravado fading. "It's probably just the wind. Old houses make all kinds of noises." But Janet couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. She clutched the journal tightly, its pages filled with the secrets of a past that refused to stay buried. As they prepared for bed, the oppressive silence of the house seemed to press in on them. The children's rooms were on the second floor, while Janet and Tom took the master bedroom on the ground floor. The night was hot and stifling, but an eerie coldness seeped into the manor. Janet lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with the images conjured by the journal's words. She heard the distant sound of chains rattling and soft whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. She tried to dismiss them as her imagination, but sleep eluded her. In the early hours of the morning, a blood-curdling scream shattered the silence. Janet and Tom bolted upright, their hearts pounding. They rushed to Emily's room, finding her standing in the corner, trembling and pointing at the empty space by her bed. "There was someone here," Emily gasped, tears streaming down her face. "A man. He was watching me." Janet hugged her daughter tightly, her own fear barely contained. "It's okay, Emily. We're here. It was just a nightmare." But deep down, she knew it was more than that. The house's dark history was beginning to reveal itself, and the Kincaid family was about to uncover secrets more terrifying than they could have ever imagined. The Kincaids' first night at Magnolia Manor had left them unsettled, but they tried to shake off the eerie feeling as the morning sun bathed the house in a warm, reassuring glow. Emily's encounter was brushed aside as a vivid nightmare, though Janet couldn't help but feel a lingering unease. Determined to bring some normalcy to their new home, the family spent the next day unpacking and exploring the grounds. The sprawling plantation was a mixture of wild beauty and decay, with overgrown gardens and dilapidated outbuildings, hinting at a once grand past. As they worked, the oppressive heat bore down on them, and the air seemed thick with a palpable tension. Emily and Jake decided to venture into the attic, their curiosity piqued by the promise of hidden treasures. They climbed the creaky stairs, their flashlights casting long shadows in the dim space. Dust particles floated like tiny specters in the beams of light, and the air was heavy with the smell of aged wood and forgotten memories. "Look at this," Jake called out, his voice muffled by the layers of dust and cobwebs. He had found an old trunk, its leather straps brittle with age. Emily joined him, and together they pried it open, revealing a trove of relics from the past. Faded photographs, yellowed letters, and a collection of old dolls. Emily's eyes were drawn to a hidden compartment in the trunk. She carefully opened it and gasped at what she found, a set of rusty slave collars and shackles. Her heart raced as she held them up, the cold metal a stark reminder of the manor's dark history. "Jake, look at this," she whispered, her voice trembling. "These were used on the slaves who lived here." Jake's face paled as he took in the significance of the discovery. They carefully put everything back and hurried downstairs to show their parents. Janet's heart sank as she examined the shackles, and Tom's expression turned grim. "This place has more secrets than we realized," Tom said, his voice tight with concern. That night, the atmosphere in the house grew more oppressive. The family gathered in the living room, trying to distract themselves with a movie, but the sense of unease was palpable. The shadows seemed to lengthen, and the air grew colder as the night wore on. Around midnight, Emily was jolted awake by a cold hand touching her face. She screamed, bolting upright in bed, her heart pounding in her chest. The rest of the family rushed to her room, finding her trembling and pointing to the corner where she swore a shadowy figure had stood moments before. "There's something here," Emily insisted, tears streaming down her face. "It touched me. It was real." Tom inspected the room, finding nothing out of the ordinary, but the fear in his daughter's eyes was undeniable. "We'll all sleep in the same room tonight," he said, trying to reassure everyone. "We'll figure this out together." The following day, Janet couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She resumed reading the old journal, desperate to understand what was happening. The entries grew darker, recounting the increasing tension and fear among the slaves. Samuel, the leader of a planned revolt, was mentioned frequently, his strength and determination a beacon of hope for the oppressed. Janet's hands shook as she read about Samuel's capture and the brutal punishment meted out to him and his fellow conspirators. Their tragic end seemed to echo through the pages, the horror of their suffering palpable. She realized that the unrest they were experiencing was tied to these events, the spirits of the past unable to find peace. Determined to uncover more, Janet and Tom visited the Savannah Historical Society. They met with Dr. Miriam Jacobs, a local historian who specialized in the region's dark past. Dr. Jacobs listened intently as Janet recounted their experiences and shared the journal. "Magnolia Manor has a notorious history," Dr. Jacobs explained. "It was one of the harshest plantations in the area. The treatment of slaves there was exceptionally cruel, and many died under horrific circumstances. It's not uncommon for places with such dark histories to harbor restless spirits." Janet felt a chill run down her spine as Dr. Jacobs continued. "The spirits you describe may be seeking justice or recognition for the suffering they endured. It's possible that their unrest is tied to something unresolved, something that keeps them trapped." Armed with this knowledge, the Kincaids returned to the manor, more determined than ever to uncover the truth and find a way to appease the spirits. Janet resumed reading the journal with renewed urgency, the words blurring as she delved deeper into the past. That night, the apparitions grew more intense. The temperature plummeted, and the house was filled with the sound of chains rattling and distant cries. Shadows moved independently of the flickering candlelight, and the walls seemed to close in around them. Emily and Jake huddled together, their fear palpable, while Janet and Tom tried to stay calm. As the clock struck midnight, the family experienced their most terrifying encounter yet. The air grew icy, and a figure materialized in the living room, a spectral man in tattered clothes, his eyes filled with pain and anger. He raised a hand, pointing accusingly at Janet, before dissolving into the ether. The family was left shaken and terrified, but Janet knew they couldn't leave. They had to uncover the truth, to face the horrors of the past, and find a way to bring peace to the restless souls of Magnolia Manor. The next morning, the Kincaids were exhausted, the events of the previous night weighing heavily on their minds. The spectral figure's appearance had left them more determined to uncover the truth behind Magnolia Manor's dark history. Janet, clutching the old journal, knew that the answers they sought lay within its yellowed pages. Janet and Tom decided to visit the Savannah Historical Society once more, hoping Dr. Miriam Jacobs could shed more light on the haunting. Emily and Jake, still shaken, agreed to stay behind and continue exploring the manor. Janet carried the journal like a talisman, the sense of urgency pushing her forward. At the Historical Society, Dr. Jacobs greeted them warmly, but with a serious expression. "I did some more digging after our last meeting," she said, leading them to a small room filled with documents and photographs. "Magnolia Manor's history is even darker than we initially thought." She handed Janet a stack of old newspapers and letters. "These documents reveal that Samuel, the leader of the revolt, was not only executed, but subjected to unspeakable torture. His fellow conspirators faced similar fates, their bodies hidden in unmarked graves around the property. The brutal overseer, a man named Elijah Blackwood, took sadistic pleasure in their suffering." Janet felt a lump in her throat as she read the horrific accounts. "Is there any way to find these graves?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Dr. Jacobs nodded. "There are maps and records that might help, but be warned, disturbing these sites could provoke the spirits further. They are already restless, and any disruption could have dangerous consequences." Back at the manor, Emily and Jake were exploring the basement, a labyrinthine space filled with old wine barrels and discarded furniture. The air was damp and musty, and the faint light from their flashlights barely penetrated the darkness. They stumbled upon a hidden door, partially obscured by a heavy tapestry. "Jake, look at this," Emily said, her voice echoing slightly. "This door wasn't on any of the blueprints we found." With a sense of foreboding, they pushed the door open, revealing a small, cramped room. The air inside was even colder, and a palpable sense of dread filled the space. On the floor, they found more slave collars and a rusted iron chain, remnants of the manor's brutal past. Jake picked up a collar, his face pale. "These poor people," he murmured. "No wonder they're still here. They suffered so much." Suddenly, a chill swept through the room, and the siblings heard the faint sound of chains rattling. The temperature plummeted, and they felt an overwhelming presence in the room. Panic set in, and they fled back upstairs, their hearts pounding. When Janet and Tom returned, Emily and Jake recounted their discovery. Janet's face grew pale as she listened, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. She opened the journal again, flipping to the last entries. "June 18th, 1857, she read aloud. "Samuel was captured today. Elijah took him to the hidden room beneath the manor, where he plans to make an example of him. The others are terrified, but I fear this is only the beginning of the bloodshed." Tears filled Janet's eyes as she continued. "July 1st, 1857. The revolt has been crushed. Samuel and his followers are dead, their bodies buried in unmarked graves. The manor is quiet now, but I feel the weight of their suffering. Their spirits will never rest." Tom placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "We need to find those graves and give them a proper burial. It's the only way to bring peace to the spirits." The family, armed with the maps and records Dr. Jacobs had provided, began their search. They combed through the overgrown grounds, following the faded paths and cryptic clues. The oppressive heat and the eerie silence made their task even more daunting. Finally, they stumbled upon a clearing near the edge of the property. The ground was uneven, the soil disturbed in a way that suggested hidden graves. Janet's heart raced as she knelt down, brushing away the dirt to reveal fragments of bone and rusted chains. "This is it," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "This is where they were buried." The family worked tirelessly, carefully excavating the makeshift graves. They placed the remains in a respectful manner, saying silent prayers for the souls who had suffered so much. As they worked, the air grew colder, and the sense of being watched intensified. Just as they finished, a sudden gust of wind swept through the clearing, and they felt a presence behind them. They turned to see the spectral figure of Samuel, his eyes filled with both sorrow and gratitude. He nodded once, then faded into the ether, leaving the Kincaids in stunned silence. That night, back in the manor, the oppressive atmosphere seemed to lift slightly. The whispers were softer, the shadows less menacing. But Janet knew their work wasn't done. She opened the journal to the final entry, her hands shaking. August 15th, 1857. I can no longer bear the weight of what we have done. Elijah's cruelty knows no bounds, and I fear the spirits will never rest. I must find a way to atone for our sins, to bring peace to those we have wronged. Janet looked at her family, determination in her eyes. We have to continue. We need to find Elijah Blackwood's resting place and ensure that he can never harm anyone again. Only then will the spirits truly be at peace. The family nodded, united in their resolve. The journey ahead was fraught with danger and uncertainty, but they were determined to see it through. Magnolia Manor's dark history demanded justice, and the Kincaids were ready to face whatever horrors awaited them. As the days turned into nights, the Kincaids found themselves caught in a relentless battle against the malevolent forces that inhabited Magnolia Manor. The air grew colder, the shadows lengthened, and the whispers became louder and more menacing. The family knew they had to confront the apparitions head-on if they were to have any hope of finding peace. One night, as the clock struck midnight, the house seemed to come alive with supernatural energy. The temperature plummeted, and a thick, unnatural fog rolled in, seeping through the cracks in the windows and doors. The oppressive atmosphere pressed down on them, making it difficult to breathe. Emily and Jake huddled together in the living room, their eyes darting around the room, following the shifting shadows. Tom and Janet sat nearby, their expressions tense and determined. They had set up a makeshift altar, hoping to use it to communicate with the spirits and offer their apologies. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the house, followed by the unmistakable sound of chains rattling. The walls seemed to pulse with energy, and the family felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Janet stood up, clutching the old journal, and began to read from it, her voice steady despite the fear gripping her heart. "We are here to acknowledge the suffering you endured," she said, her voice echoing through the room. "We seek to understand your pain and to offer our sincerest apologies for the atrocities committed against you." As she spoke, the room grew even colder, and the fog thickened, coalescing into the forms of ghostly apparitions. The spirits of the enslaved men and women appeared before them, their faces etched with sorrow and anger. Among them, the figure of Samuel stood out, his eyes burning with intensity. Tom stepped forward, his voice shaking. "We want to help you find peace. Please tell us what we need to do." The spirits remained silent, their expressions unwavering. Then, without warning, the room was filled with a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once. The noise was deafening, and the family clapped their hands over their ears, struggling to make sense of the chaos. One voice rose above the rest, clear and authoritative. It was Samuel. "You must find the one who brought this suffering upon us. Elijah Blackwood must be stopped." Janet nodded, tears streaming down her face. "We will find him. We will make sure he can never harm anyone again." The apparitions began to fade, but the coldness remained. The family knew their task was far from over. They had to locate Elijah Blackwood's resting place and ensure he could no longer torment the spirits or anyone else. The next day, armed with the journal and the maps Dr. Jacobs had provided, the family resumed their search. They combed through the plantation's overgrown grounds, following the faint traces of old paths and searching for any clues that might lead them to Blackwood's grave. As they ventured deeper into the woods surrounding the manor, the sense of unease grew. The trees seemed to close in around them, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. They stumbled upon an old, crumbling mausoleum hidden beneath the tangled underbrush. "This has to be it," Tom said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is where he must be buried." The entrance to the mausoleum was sealed with a heavy stone door, but with some effort they managed to push it open. Inside, the air was stale and filled with the smell of damp earth. The walls were lined with niches, each containing the remains of long-dead members of the Blackwood family. At the center of the mausoleum, they found a large, ornate sarcophagus. The inscription on it confirmed their suspicions. Elijah Blackwood lay within. Janet stepped forward, her hands trembling as she placed the journal on top of the sarcophagus. "We know what you did," she said, her voice echoing in the confined space. "Your cruelty and hatred have caused unimaginable suffering. We are here to put an end to it." As she spoke, the temperature in the mausoleum dropped sharply, and the flickering light of their lanterns seemed to dim. The oppressive atmosphere grew heavier, and the family felt a malevolent presence surround them. Without warning, the lid of the sarcophagus began to move, sliding open with a grinding sound. The family stepped back, their hearts pounding in their chests. A dark, shadowy figure rose from the sarcophagus, its eyes glowing with an eerie, unnatural light. Elijah Blackwood's spirit had awakened, and his presence filled the mausoleum with a palpable sense of evil. He stood before them, a twisted smile on his face, his voice a low, menacing growl. "You dare to challenge me?" he sneered. "You think you can undo the power I hold?" Janet stepped forward, her fear replaced by a fierce determination. "We will stop you," she said, her voice steady. "You have tormented these spirits long enough. Your reign of terror ends here." The family joined hands, forming a circle around the sarcophagus. They began to recite a cleansing ritual Dr. Jacobs had given them, their voices strong and unwavering. The air around them crackled with energy, and the spirit of Elijah Blackwood howled in rage. As they continued the ritual, the dark figure began to waver, its form becoming less solid. The oppressive atmosphere lifted slightly, and the malevolent presence began to weaken. With one final, defiant scream, Elijah Blackwood's spirit was torn apart, dissolving into nothingness. The family collapsed to the ground, exhausted but relieved. The air in the mausoleum was now clear, and the oppressive weight of evil had lifted. They knew that the spirits of the enslaved men and women would finally be able to find peace. As they left the mausoleum, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a warm, golden light over the plantation. The oppressive atmosphere that had plagued Magnolia Manor was gone, replaced by a sense of calm and serenity. Back at the manor, the family gathered in the living room, their faces reflecting both relief and determination. They had faced unimaginable horrors and had come through it stronger and more united. Janet looked at her family, pride and gratitude in her eyes. "We did it. We brought peace to this place. The spirits can finally rest." Tom nodded, his arm around her shoulders. "And we'll make sure their stories are never forgotten. Magnolia Manor will be a place of remembrance and healing." Emily and Jake smiled, their fear replaced by a sense of accomplishment. They knew that their lives had been forever changed by their experiences, but they were ready to move forward, honoring the past while building a brighter future. Magnolia Manor, once a place of horror and suffering, had become a symbol of redemption and hope. The Kincaids had not only uncovered its dark history, but had also helped to heal the wounds that had festered for generations. And in doing so, they had found a new sense of purpose and strength as a family. The Kincaids felt a profound sense of relief after their encounter with Elijah Blackwood's spirit. The oppressive weight that had once shrouded Magnolia Manor lifted, replaced by an air of tranquility. However, as they began to settle back into their routines, Janet couldn't shake the feeling that there was still one final piece of the puzzle missing. Janet spent the following days immersed in the old journal, retracing the steps and events that had led to their ordeal. Late one evening, while she was deep into the journal, she came across a passage that sent chills down her spine. August 20th, 1857. "I can no longer bear the weight of our sins. Elijah's cruelty has marked this land, and even in death he holds dominion over us. Hidden beneath this manor lies the source of his power, a cursed artifact that binds the spirits to this place. I fear what will happen if it is not destroyed." Janet read the passage aloud to Tom, Emily, and Jake, who had gathered around her. The words seemed to echo through the room, filling them with a renewed sense of urgency. "An artifact," Tom mused, frowning. "That must be what's still holding the spirits here." Emily looked at her mother, eyes wide. "We need to find it and destroy it, don't we?" Janet nodded, determination etched on her face. "We do. It's the only way to ensure the spirits can truly find peace." Armed with this newfound knowledge, the family set out to search the manor for the hidden artifact. They combed through every room, nook, and cranny, following any clue that might lead them to the source of Elijah Blackwood's power. Their search led them to the basement, a dark and foreboding space they had previously avoided. The basement was cluttered with old furniture, dusty crates, and cobwebs that hung like curtains from the ceiling. As they moved deeper into the basement, the air grew colder, and a sense of unease settled over them. In the far corner, partially hidden behind a stack of old crates, they found a trap door. The wood was ancient and rotting, but the iron handle was still intact. With a collective effort, they pulled the trap door open, revealing a narrow staircase leading further underground. Emily held up her flashlight, peering into the darkness. "This must be it," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The staircase led them to a hidden chamber beneath the manor, a place that seemed untouched by time. The walls were lined with symbols and markings, and in the center of the room stood a pedestal, atop which lay a small, intricately carved box. Janet stepped forward, her heart pounding. "This must be the artifact," she said, reaching out to lift the box. As her fingers touched the box, a wave of cold air swept through the chamber, and the ghostly apparitions of the enslaved men and women appeared once more. Samuel stood at the forefront, his eyes filled with a mix of hope and desperation. "You have found it," he said, his voice echoing in the small space. "The artifact binds us to this place. It must be destroyed." Janet nodded, lifting the box from the pedestal. "We will," she promised. "We'll make sure your spirits are free." With the box in hand, the family made their way back upstairs. They gathered in the living room, the artifact placed carefully on the table before them. The box seemed to pulsate with a dark energy, and the air around it was thick with an almost tangible malevolence. Tom picked up a hammer, his expression resolute. "Are we ready for this?" he asked, looking around at his family. Janet, Emily, and Jake nodded, their faces set with determination. "Do it," Janet said. Tom raised the hammer and brought it down on the box with all his might. The impact shattered the box, releasing a burst of cold air and a dark, swirling mist. The mist dissipated quickly, leaving behind a sense of calm and quiet. As the box was destroyed, the apparitions of the enslaved men and women appeared one final time. Their expressions were peaceful, their eyes filled with gratitude. Samuel stepped forward, his form becoming more transparent. "Thank you," he said softly. "You have freed us. We can finally rest." The spirits began to fade, dissolving into the air like mist in the morning sun. The oppressive atmosphere that had once plagued Magnolia Manor was gone, replaced by a sense of peace and serenity. The Kincaid stood in silence, the enormity of what they had accomplished washing over them. They had faced unimaginable horrors and had emerged victorious, bringing peace to the spirits that had long been tormented. Janet looked at her family, her heart swelling with pride and relief. "We did it," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "We brought them peace." Tom hugged her tightly, his own relief evident. "And we've made sure their stories will be remembered." In the days that followed, the family worked to restore Magnolia Manor, transforming it into a place of remembrance and healing. They created a memorial for the enslaved men and women who had suffered there, ensuring that their stories would never be forgotten. Magnolia Manor, once a symbol of horror and suffering, had become a beacon of hope and redemption. The Kincaids had not only uncovered its dark history, but had also helped to heal the wounds that had festered for generations. And in doing so, they had found a new sense of purpose and strength as a family. As the sun set over the restored plantation, Janet stood on the porch, looking out over the tranquil grounds. She felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that they had done the right thing. The spirits of Magnolia Manor were finally at rest, and the Kincaid family had forged a new legacy, one of courage, compassion, and redemption.